Hi, so today I'm going to be discussing, Slaughterhouse Five by Kurt Vonnegut and its relation to PTSD and war trauma. Slaughterhouse Five, also known under the Children's Crusade, was first published in 1969 by the author Kurt Vonnegut. It is one of the most read anti-war novels to date. Now, what do we mean by anti-war novel? Well, most anti-war novels are considered anti-war novels. Technically, we don't actually know if the author would consider them anti-war novels. Most of the time, they just kind of document the horrors of war, so maybe that's what makes an anti-war novel. When you look up anti-war books, Slaughterhouse Five is in the first search result, so that's interesting. The book itself, though the main war focused on is World War II in the novel because the main character lived through it, was published in the middle of another long, the Vietnam War. So it's understandable that a book like this was probably necessary for the time that it came out. In fact, the book may have been relatable for many people who had experienced the war during Vietnam or earlier war. So at this time, you had many men going to war and coming back to war, and many people dealing with the troubles of war and the trauma that it often brings people and families. The main character, Billy Pilgrim, had come unstuck in time. Billy often finds himself in different times of his life. The novel does so well at this, in fact, that it is often difficult to truly tell that these are just sorts of flashbacks to times in Billy's life. And that's quite true. There's a focus on him being a prisoner of war by the Germans and all the horrors that entailed, as well as the Dresden bombing of February 1945 that lasted 2 days. Throughout, we experience these sort of flashbacks and vivid memories from the point of view of the main character. There is a nice and well-written mix of both humor and darkness. In general, the book had a lot of sardonic, dark humor. I love that style of writing, and I'm definitely going to have to check out more of Vonnegut's books because of this writing style. Posttraumatic stress disorder was first used in the DSM-3 in 1980. Since then, it has become a sort of household name. Most people know what it is, or at least the basics of it, or know someone often that experiences it. Though not all PTSD, and a lot of PTSD people who have been in war, a lot of times it's other horrible events in life, which many things can happen, you know. PTSD is a massive thing when it comes to people who have gone through war and soldiers, and so most have heard it called PTSD now, but before 1980, in relation to war, it was often called shell shock or war neurosis. In fact, one of my favorite shows called Outlander did a whole episode called Famous Last Resort, episode relating to PTSD, which is another fascinating look on it. The symptoms of PTSD include flashbacks, reliving the event, recurring memories of the event, trouble focusing, nightmares, feeling on edge, and struggling with hearing about similar events. So say, almost anyone, even people who don't have PTSD, will often struggle with hearing about events they've been through, that are traumatic in some way, because most people will experience some sort of trauma in their life. It just depends on how that affects them in the future. If you as a child and you hear someone talking about it, you're gonna feel something. Obviously, there are many, many more symptoms to this, and it's a lot more complex of an issue than I'm going to talk about in this video. So if you're interested in learning about more symptoms of PTSD and the ailment in general, there are articles linked below, and if you have PTSD and you want to share your experiences, write them down in the comments. Slaughterhouse Five, we can see the main character experience many of these symptoms. He often finds himself in the past reliving certain moments of his life. He dissociates and has trouble staying in the moment, especially when something kind of triggers this to happen, like if he hears about something similar to an event he's been through. He particularly focuses on the bombing of Dresden, obviously, because it's a traumatic event, and becoming a prisoner of war. Though there are many other parts of his life that he does revert back to from time to time, whether it be a plane crash where he split his head open, his pre-war days, his time in the psych ward hospital, or what I think was considered that, right? And more. I don't think it was ever named that, but that was what was implied. We should also discuss one of the stranger parts of the novel. Here we go, the Tromal Fedorians. These odd, plunger-like space creatures are depicted in Billy's sort of fantasies. He has a fantasy that he is abducted by these creatures, and much of his fantasy had parallels to the events that had actually happened to Billy. As he was a prisoner of war during World War II, it is familiar to him to be imprisoned and humiliated, And so by going through this again, it must not be strange to him to in his fantasies, because if you've been through something, your mind will usually take the event and spin it in different ways. The Tromal Fedorians and their capture of Billy could be compared to his capture by the Germans in many ways. The stripping him naked when he is first captured, for example. Also, the lack of explanation given. You see, and the Germans will never give an explanation. The Tromal Fedorians will give explanations for many things, but they will not give an explanation for why, because they're like, why anything? At the same time, the Tromal Fedorians and their ideas are a kind of way to help Billy cope what he's gone through. You see, a lot of people find ways of coping with traumatic events through certain things. Maybe it is through fantasies, maybe it's through art and music. That time to them is like a range of mountains. Yes, the Tromal Fedorians believe that time is a range of mountains, that they could see it all at once. It was all always there. See, that's important. For someone like Billy, this could be comforting. These bad things were always there. They were always going to happen. At least that's how the Tromal Fedorians describe it. This also means that certain deaths were always going to happen. Instead of mourning, the Tromal Fedorians deal with death by saying, so it goes. It isn't a stretch to say that this must be a comforting way to accept the deaths of so many that Billy has seen in front of his face. We get most of this through Billy's perspective, and it almost seems like a first-hand glance at what the protagonist dealing with all that he had been through and all of the trauma. Although we know and are hinted at throughout the book that many of the time travel scenarios and the hallucinations and the fantasies that Billy's mind comes up with are not true, they often seem so real to the reader. I remember the first time I read this book, I couldn't tell whether it was real or not, because maybe I was kind of skimming more than I should have been, and maybe I should have read it. I'm very bad at that, but I read it again, and honestly, it makes a lot more sense than it did. It is truly, for lack of a better term, a kind of trip of a book. Like, you kind of go through these nice cut scenes. It almost feels like you're reading a movie in a way. It's that well done. Especially with the matter-of-factness that most of it is described in, it really immerses you into the chaos, the grief, and the comedy of it all. It doesn't really feel like these are flashbacks or vivid hallucinations. This is what makes it realistic and such a great novel. Of course, I can't say that Billy's experience is truly a realistic depiction of PTSD, as I have never been diagnosed with anything like that, but I do find the similarities fascinating. For a novel that was written 10 years before the term for post-traumatic stress disorder was even coined professionally, this has a lot of the same key elements that the diagnosis does. And it is also a genuinely close-up look at someone dealing with the horrors of war and the effect that that has on the human psyche and the mind sometimes. I think that's what makes the book great, too. The fact that we truly experience it through the eyes of Pilgrim, rather than the prodding outside force that we sometimes see mental disorders or mental illnesses portrayed in. It is a lot more close-up and genuine, and I think that's what makes it great. See, that last point, I think sometimes we see, like, for example, I kind of major OCD and anxiety, and the way it's depicted in media is that, oh, you're just a clean freak, you're just this or that. You don't really know what it's like for me to have this constant poking, prodding feeling that I have to have things a certain way, or mentally things aren't straight, so I have to, like, if I feel like organizing things, a lot of times it's because mentally my brain is just pushing me, and it's painful, you know? And I have had some of the worst times in my life come from like breakdowns and stuff like that at school, because I feel that everything is not in order, everything is not straight, and it's just so much more than what it is often portrayed as. And I think that is why Slaughterhouse Five novel, because PTSD is so much more than the whole, Vietnam flashbacks joke, or, yeah, I understand that it's so much more than that. I think for us to truly understand, one of the ways we can truly understand it is see it through the perspective, or at least the perspective of a character that's been through something like that. So to incorporate that into our fiction and our lives of, like, reading fiction and being interested in, sci-fi or whatever it may be, I think that is kind of important, especially in the portrayal of mental illness and, disorder. It feels more like it's poking and prodding from the outside rather than going through it. You know, to discuss more of this, I'm done with my main essay, but to discuss more of this, I read, for example, Turtles All the Way Down. Now, I haven't read much John Green, but say Turtles All the Way Down, I think was really one of the first books that made me feel like, yeah, like that's what anxiety is kind of like for me. I think that it didn't have that sort of poking feeling that some fiction does when it tries to portray the minds of people who have been through really bad things or who are going through really bad things. So I think that's why novels like this are very important to depicting war and PTSD and similar topics in such a way. I just think that's quite important to portray it genuinely like this, rather than just the, oh, I'm having flashbacks. Like, it's so much more than that. It's a lot more horrible than that, and so are most mental illnesses and problems. Yeah, that would conclude my short little thing I've just described on Slaughterhouse Five and how it relates to PTSD and early depictions of stuff like PTSD and war and how that affects people, and good depictions of that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's it. Go check out my other videos. I did a little analyzation of the song Californication, and I think in my last video, depends